I want to start by picking up on what John Daly was just talking about putting a price on carbon and the politics of that. John talked about the economics of it and change behaviour and so on, but one of the things you said, John, was that we have to admit that we're going to pay more. I did an interview recently with Climate Change Minister Greg Combet, and I said to the Minister, I said, will you tell our listeners now on the radio station that they can expect to pay more for their power? And he wouldn't answer that question. He talked about compensating people on low incomes and so on and so forth, and I said, yes, that's all fine, okay, we'll compensate. Can you tell people now that they can expect, people like me on a reasonable wage, that they can expect to pay more for their electricity bills? He wouldn't answer the question. As long as a minister like Greg Combet, a very impressive man, leading this, won't admit to the bleeding obvious, haven't we really still got a huge political problem here?
I think we do, and I think that problem is made worse by the fact that politicians are not, well, they've started to talk about it, which is comforting. Power prices are going to go up very significantly over the next 5 years anyway, and indeed for reasons that by and large have got nothing to do with carbon. Our power prices are likely to double in real terms over the next 5 years, and that's because the cost of building power stations is going up in real terms, because the cost of gas, which fires some of those power stations, is going up very quickly in real terms as Australian gas essentially starts to catch up to world prices. We've been paying very, very low prices for our gas, and it's going to go up towards world price parity. And thirdly, we've had a 10 or 15-year holiday in which we didn't, by and large, pay very much to increase the transmission capacity of the grid. That grid costs you about 50% of your power bill. That's 50% of the cost of providing power to your home. Essentially, because we've sweated that asset a lot harder over the last 10 or 15 years, we didn't build very much of it, so the price didn't go up. That's been a great holiday. It was a great trick while it lasted, but it's coming to an end. And then on top of that, particularly in New South Wales and Queensland, we've got a lot of air conditioners going in. Air conditioners add to peak load, and peak load is what drives transmission investment. So as I said, power prices are going to double over the next 5 years for reasons that have got by and large nothing to do with carbon or carbon pricing. That said, carbon pricing will add about 25 to 50% to people's electricity bills, probably more like 25%, over the next 5 years from today. So ironically, in the overall scheme of power price increases, it won't be a lot, but people are going to need to get used to the fact that there are substantial increases to power prices coming, and there's actually relatively little that we can do about it.
John, I'll get you to pull that microphone just a touch closer to you. Don Henry, John's right, of course. Power prices are going to go up anyway, regardless of whether we price carbon or not, but doesn't that make it even harder? Because an opportunistic politician can blame all those power price increases on a carbon price and efforts to tackle climate change, and make it even harder for a government to actually push something like that through.
Peter, that's right. I mean, this is sitting there right for a scare campaign and to focus us all on our hip pocket rather than our future. And I suppose I'd like to make an important point here. I think if we sit back and assume our politics is going to lead us out of this, I think we're being foolish. And at the end of the day, I'd say this is going to need real people power to get this over the line. And let me just let you know that people power can work. 2 hours ago, there's an announcement out of Canberra that the Greens and the government have negotiated to return $100 million to the solar flagships program that was cut for flood assistance. Now, people deserve flood and cyclone assistance, but we don't have to cut our new emerging cleaner economy to do it. And I want to let you know that's happened because tens of thousands of people have cared and got hold of their politicians, and the government and Greens have sat down and negotiated out. So, Peter, I don't want to sit there and, with the greatest respect, leave it to my elected representative to deliver this. There is a downside there will be some cost increases, but the future of our planet is at stake. So let's take responsibility for that personally and get out there and give this a shake.
Cathy Oak, you're an elected representative.
I was actually going to follow on from what Don was saying and maybe ignore the elected rep part, but I'm looking at the transition decade banner over here and I can see a Beyond Zero Emissions t-shirt in the audience as well, and many other community campaigners. And actually I just want to follow on from what Don was saying, that it really is about the community saying we are willing and ready and able to pay this extra money that's going to be needed to make the transition to a clean energy future. And I remember being excited at last year's SLF festival when the Transition Decade was launched and getting really excited about all the different groups working together and all the different projects in our community that if they're all acted on, we would be in the future that we need to be. So, I mean, I look forward to what's happening at the SLF this year, but from a political point of view, yeah, I mean, I think, unfortunately, we do need political leaders to act, though. We need them to act and we need them to make important decisions and not be swayed by lobbyists to be, to have that pollution rewarded.
That all sounds great, and if everyone gets on and does it, and all the rest of it. But John, you began by talking about the fact that we need to price things to change behaviour, because people respond to price signals, and they respond in two ways. They respond by using something less, or they respond by voting out the government that put the price up. I mean, this is the problem. I mean, the situation at the moment with green energy, if you pay extra to source green energy through your electricity provider, there was a great surge in people signing up for that. The numbers are now declining. People don't want to pay more because they're suffering from other cost increases, price of vegetables, what have you.
Look, there's no doubt it's a difficult problem, but last time I checked, I paid taxes, and so did most other people. Governments have succeeded in imposing taxes historically, and I dare say they'll succeed again. So I don't think it's impossible. But as Don says, it's all about ensuring that there is political will, and it's not just about elected representatives, it's about as many people as possible putting pressure on their elected representatives to do things. Democracies are terrible forms of government. They're very slow, they're tedious, they can take a long time to make decisions, but the virtue of them is that in the long run, if people want something, it will happen, and that's why it's important that we commit as a community to saying, we understand this is going to cost us a bit more, but the end that we are trying to serve in terms of trying to reduce the planet's carbon emissions and therefore protect our climate as a world is worth it. And I think if you look at the long run of Australian political history over the last 20 years, a little like the climate, it goes up and down, one year's hotter than the next, but over the long run of 20 years, if I'd stood up here 25 years ago and said, we need to impose a tax on carbon emissions, you would have thought I was a lunatic. And if I'd stood up here 10 years ago, there would have been, a few people cheering, and there'd have been an awful lot of people still thinking I was a lunatic. And today, it's a relatively mainstream position. That's actually progress in the long run.
Isabella, I want to come to you because you talked about the Climate Fund and the breakthroughs at Cancun, but we earlier had I think it was called the Clean Development Mechanism, which was a way of developed nations helping to fund clean development in developing nations. And that was very problematic because some of the things that were funded didn't happen or weren't properly policed or measured. And also it's a kind of letting off the hook. A country like Australia can say, we've saved some Indonesian rainforests, so we don't really have to worry so much about how much coal we're burning. So is the new climate fund at Cancun, is that going to be different?
Thank you, Peter. I think this is really a challenging question because none of us actually knows how we'll actually deliver the given promise of Cancun. But the 10 years of experience in CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, definitely gives us one important message, that CDM projects were driven by certain regional or geographic interest. So money would flow or projects would flow to certain countries in the world, those that actually could provide some investment opportunities. So China would benefit from CDM, Brazil, but small, poor countries were extremely neglected in this 10-year period. So I think what Cancun sort of tries to provide is this new platform to deliver equitable climate change adaptation approach, and at the core of this approach are the most vulnerable countries that need financial support the most. So countries such as small island states, least developed countries, and countries in Africa. So those would be in the core of the interest of Green Climate Fund.
Okay, I want to open up. I have more questions, but I want to offer a chance for the audience to ask questions of our panellists. There's a microphone, actually there's two microphones, one here and one here.
I have a question mainly for Don and for John, though firstly can I just make a really quick comment given that we're talking about power prices. If you look at the Australian Bureau of Agriculture and Resource Economics report, they're really proud of telling us that Australia has some of the cheapest power prices in the world. The flip side of that is that most places in the world get by perfectly fine paying 50 to 100% more than we do for our power. But the question to Don and John mainly is, can you guys start talking about stuff other than carbon pricing as if it's the only main game in town? Like, we understand it's the main thing on the political spectrum this year, but to paraphrase you, John, I frankly fail to see how carbon pricing is going to be efficient at doing anything but switching to gas. When you start looking at the zero emissions options that you need, wind, solar, thermal, you can talk about nukes and CCS if you want, but there's a lot more issues there. You're going to need a lot more than just a price on carbon. Countries that are actually reducing emissions for renewable energy are doing it with feed-in tariffs, with renewable portfolio standards that are actually able to directly incentivise those renewable energies, where a low carbon price is going to do very little but get a switch to gas, and we're definitely going to need other measures if we're going to solve the full problem.
Okay.
Yeah, look, I absolutely agree with you. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, I think we need this year a carbon price, a further boost to renewables, and I think, for instance, the solar flagships program, it's very, very important. I'm pleased to see that 100 million going back into it. We need more. And it's about time we took a major step forward on energy efficiency in Australia as well. So you're absolutely right. Price plus these other measures to really boost now the zero emission economy we're going to need.
Patrick, I'd absolutely agree with you on many things. Firstly, though, I'd say a price will have many impacts other than just pushing a switch to gas. That's doubtless going to be an important impact of it. But it will also create significant incentives, particularly for industry, to reduce its power consumption. And for some industries, things like cement actually have very substantial direct emissions. So the actual process of making cement generates carbon emissions, generates CO2 that contributes to the global warming problems. And so creating economic incentives for those industries to change how they do things is quite important. And the track record elsewhere is that those industries have actually wound up doing a lot to reduce their emissions, and I think will do even more as the technology starts to get developed, incented by a price. That said, I would agree with both of you that there is a huge place for complementary measures, as they're known in the trade, but for various measures other than a price on carbon. And that's particularly because we're talking about an innovation shift in how we produce electricity. And the history of electricity production is we only got electricity in the first place from coal-fired power stations and from hydroelectricity because essentially government bankrolled the development of that technology and then the initial implementation of that technology. And I suspect the same will be true again for the next generation of energy technologies. That said, there are clever ways and not so clever ways of delivering that government assistance. And one of the issues with things like grant schemes is that they tend in the end to result in very little actually happening. And it is one of the advantages of things that you mentioned, like rebates and feed-in tariffs, that they effectively create a market for new technologies. Now, you do need to be careful of how those things are developed because, ironically, the price of those new technologies often comes down quite quickly, and you don't want to get into a situation in which government is essentially paying people to do something for nothing, and that can be very expensive for all of us. And the costs of reductions in, say, solar technology so far, you know, those solar panels have been costing us in the order of, I think it's around $200 a tonne of carbon, which is kind of pricey, if that's what you're doing it for. Now, if you're doing it to try and develop industry and you're trying to develop technology, that's fine, but you've got to be really clear that that's what you're doing. And for example, you don't necessarily want mass rollout if it's still costing you $200 a tonne. You want to, at $200 a tonne, be incenting significant development and innovation. You want to be then incenting mass rollout at the point that it's only costing you, say, $70 or $80 a tonne, which I suspect is where the long-term price will probably go.
Kathy, you wanted to add something?
And I'm conscious of the long queue of questions coming, and we've only got a short amount of time, but you mentioned concrete, and I think two things I wanted to say, that it's not just about the carbon price, it's also about investing in renewable energy, and I agree with you completely, and I think investment in large-scale solar is essential and much needed. But at the City of Melbourne, we have started the conversation about the impact of a carbon price on our budget and our costs, and I think that one of the important things about carbon pricing is it does change behaviour and does change the way we think about our budget. And we have had a conversation over many years about increasing the amount of green bitumen that we have in the City of Melbourne and citywide, produced just down in Dynon Road. And it might encourage us to invest more in green bitumen sooner rather than later, because it will be cheaper to do so rather than to not.
The invisible hand at work.
That's right.
Okay, we'll take the next question, please.
This is a general question to the panel. Due to the seriousness of the problem, I'm curious to know why there's been no mention of nuclear energy as an alternative source to our CO2 emitting fossil fuel power stations, which contribute most of the pollution.
Okay, the nuclear question.
There are some countries that have chosen that option. The Australian Conservation Foundation's got this view that we shouldn't go there. And one of the problems is, with nuclear power, we still haven't got long-term durable solutions to nuclear waste. And so we may solve one problem, emissions reduction, but create another where we're producing poisonous waste that remains poisonous for 10,000, 20,000 years plus. And we just take the moral view, that's wrong, it's not smart, let's go other paths to generate zero emission energy, such as solar, in this sunny country of ours.
Well, I actually have a slightly different view, Don, which is not that we should and not that we shouldn't, but that we should create the option. Because this is essentially a question about how are we going to produce energy in 15, 20 years' time. And the short answer to that is we don't know. We don't know which technologies are going to be cheap, and we don't know which technologies are going to be effective. It is very possible, for example, that nuclear power will turn out to be extremely expensive. The price of building nuclear power stations has been going up quite rapidly in France and the United States over the last 20 years. On the current technology and current reserves of uranium, we probably only have about 50 years' worth of reserves left. It could wind up being really expensive. On the other hand, there are new forms of nuclear power being developed which use far, far less uranium, literally 1/50th of the amount of uranium. The Chinese are busy building nuclear power stations like it's going out of fashion, and may well bring down the price very substantially, although we need to be very comfortable as Australians that we're happy to live with the risk of those power stations. But the point is, we don't know. We're talking about, what's it all going to look like in 15 years' time? Because even if Australia decided today to commit to building a nuclear power station as fast as it possibly could, it would probably take us about 20 years before it started producing electricity. However, there's about 3 or 4 years of that, the first 3 or 4 years, in which we don't actually build anything. We get a whole bunch of regulatory stuff sorted out. We get a whole bunch of capacity created in terms of people knowing what they're doing, in terms of the regimes being in place. And we would suggest that is actually not a bad option for Australia. We should actually go ahead and do that stuff. It won't cost us very much, and it buys us an option. It means that if it does turn out that nuclear power is, relatively speaking, safe and relatively speaking cheap, we're 3 or 4 years closer to it than we would be otherwise.
Okay, we'll take another question. Thank you.
My question is relatively simple, I think. It's about people power. My husband and I work within a community that's completely disengaged to this issue. They're a migrant community, and they're made up of people who are living under the poverty line or, just aren't that wealthy, and are people who came here for a particular dream that might be to aspire to owning 1, 2 or 3 cars, a McMansion in the outer suburbs, or they already live there and public transport's shocking. I mean, how are we even supposed to engage these people, and are they important to this discussion?
Thank you very much. I think this is the crucial question to all of us in order to lead us to a better future. And this is to talk about international level, but also, how we design the future of our communities. And when we talk about the most disadvantaged communities on the UNFCCC level, in fact, we tend to talk about developing countries. And quite often, we do not talk about most vulnerable communities in rich countries. And I think there is a great opportunity for the local government that got this great recognition in Cancun to design new governance structure in order to empower local community in the decision-making process, in order to deliver more participatory engagement in climate actions. And quite often we talk about adaptation measures, sort of delivering safeguard development mechanisms. And I think in this case, we have to remember that when we talk about adaptation, we shouldn't talk about adaptation globally and consider developed and developing countries. We should also think about our communities, the poorest of the poor, the most disadvantaged people, all those who basically do not have engagement with the decision-making process in the democratic system. So the role of cities here, I think it's really crucial. Thank you.
I thought Don was about to. I think it's an incredibly important question, and I know within the City of Melbourne, one project that we're working on is Opportunities for Carlton project, and one of the key themes within that is an eco-Carlton, eco-city, and we've got a meeting coming up, I believe, in March, and that is all about how to engage the whole community and how do we work with all layers, all levels within that one suburb, but hopefully then, that model and the approach that hopefully is successful within that Opportunities for Carlton project and what we achieve in the eco-city component of it will be able to be rolled out across other precincts within the municipality. And I know that there are a lot of local governments within Victoria who are working very successfully with a range of their populations. It's a very important question.
Kathy, there are good programs out there. It's a great question. I wanted to mention something that's important that you raise. As we move to a lower polluting economy, it's really important we do that transition in a fair way. And so low-income households do need assistance and should be supported. We'll hear a lot of debate about how much compensation or assistance industry should get. I think a really crucial thing for us as Australians is to make sure this is fair and lower income people are assisted.
Okay, I think we have 4 people already waiting by the microphone, so what I'll do is get you to each give your questions now because we're running out of time, so keep your questions brief. We'll take all 4 and then I'll allow the panel to respond to whichever one they choose. Okay,
So very quickly on the topic of carbon trading, it sounded just a little bit like Ronald Reagan was in the room a bit earlier, in fact, almost taken directly from one of his State of the Union addresses in either, I think it was 82, about the magic of the marketplace. Now what's kind of interesting about that is that Reagan had a substantial hand in changing the way that credit markets were regulated in the United States and the financial services more generally, which in large part helped to cause the global financial crisis. So there's what happens when you take something that really should be highly regulated, for example, carbon emissions, and you monetize it, or right, you bring economists into the fray. So here's a quick question: would you take something like murder or crime of some kind and right, engage in cap and trade, so I get 0.0001 murders per year, and if somebody's really pissed off, I could sell mine to them and they can buy a bunch and kill somebody, right? You don't do that, and the reason you don't do that is because it's an ethical question, and our environment is an ethical issue, and good stewardship is a virtue so high that economists can't touch it, and you can't monetize it. And to bring right what this is into economics is to bastardize what is really something of virtue.
Okay, well, thank you. We'll take the comment or question from this side briefly. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you. Can we tax coal exports?
Okay, a nice clear question, that one. Thank you.
My question comes partly from what Don was talking about earlier about solving one problem and then creating another one, and it's specifically about population. It's obvious that there's a whole lot of planetary life support systems that are heading west dramatically as a direct result of population pressure, and that includes things like water. Biodiversity is in the process of the biggest mass extinction phase for some 65 million years. The next wars are going to be about water, and food is a big crisis as well. It seems to me that we will solve the energy issue, but we won't solve all these other things that are going to happen in tandem with climate change. I'd like the panel to comment on that.
Okay, question of population and its impact on other environmental effects. Yes, final question here, and then we'll throw it back to the panel.
I was just wondering if any members of the panel, perhaps Don or John, others too certainly, would like to just explain a bit more about the mechanics of applying this tax on carbon or whatever. I mean, I think a lot of people in the community are still bamboozled about what the whole debate is about when it comes to carbon tax. I mean, are we only talking about the tax down the line at the end user, be it the household or the factory or a place like this that uses electricity? Is that the only place? Is that where it's going to be applied? Is that where the market signals get sent back up the line and the big producers of carbon at the top change their ways?
Okay.
Or I'm about finished. Or has it been considered why not apply a tax further up the line? I mean, why not measure the outputs of a big power station and apply a tax to them in the hope that the market signal will be much nearer to home?
We have 4 minutes for the panel to answer them, and we'll start with you, Don.
Yes, no, yes, and perhaps. No, I'll pick a couple of those questions. I'll leave the last one, I suspect, for John and others. Yes, we do need to stabilise population, but we also need to realise our consumption rates are a crucial part of this. John mentioned we are the highest per person greenhouse polluters on Earth, so it's population. Yes, we need to stabilise, but we have to get our pollution down. We've got to cut that pollution. I want to mention one thing, because I thought it was quite a good question on market mechanisms versus regulation. I think we've got to have a basket of solutions here. The message you and I have to deliver to our representatives is that we've got to cut pollution. There's a basket of measures, a price, boosting renewables and energy efficiency, and yes, we need better regulation. We do need a climate trigger in our federal environment legislation. I'd have the view that, for example, our big LNG projects, because they potentially emit so much emissions, actually need to be regulated with a trigger in our environment protection legislation federally.
Okay, Isabella, I'll just go down the line and respond to whichever part of whichever question you feel appropriate.
Thank you, Peter. I think I'll pick the population question, which I found really interesting. And I think I'd like to comment first that climate change is definitely one of the greatest challenges, security challenges of this era. And no matter what will be done, we have to bear in mind that climate change will contribute largely to this new effect of destabilizing population movement. So we will, in the next years, we'll notice climate forest migration, for instance, from small island states, only because of the sea level rise. And the challenging question is where the small islands population will be displaced. And I think Australia, it's a beautiful, great country with large capacity, and I'm sure that there might be benefits of those population movements. I agree that climate change, it's a great challenge in terms of food security, but with all scientific evidence at the moment and with our technology, I would argue that with good governance and good plans, we can actually balance inequalities. So perhaps climate change actually gives us new opportunity to bring new balance to this world. So I would look at climate change challenges also as a way of new opportunities. It's just we all need to plan well so that the issue of governance, transparency and accountability that I've mentioned earlier are crucial. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabella. Kathy.
I'm going to avoid the questions. Avoid the questions and actually mention something that hasn't been mentioned here tonight, and it's the power of young people, and that we have got exceptionally talented young people all around the world who are acting on climate change in incredibly positive and powerful ways. And tonight, before I came on stage, 2 students from the Melbourne Girls College, I believe they're sitting over there, but they asked if I could plug their event as part of the Sustainable Living Festival, which is the world's first ever zero-carbon pedal-powered moonlight cinema. And it's next Friday night at the Melbourne Girls College in Richmond, and I did want to plug it, but also acknowledge that young people are doing amazing things, and Melbourne Girls College is an exceptional case in point, and their environmental group and their environmental students I always am incredibly proud when I meet them, and so thank you for stopping me tonight, and well done.
Okay, John Daly, in 15 seconds or less, explain how the carbon tax / emissions trading scheme will work, and tell us whether we should tax coal exports.
Right. I was hoping I could have 2.5 hours to talk about financial services regulation, Peter, because I thought that would just be, much more fun. Financial services illustrates the importance of designing markets well. Australians borrow an awful lot of money for their houses, and their banks did not get into a whole bunch of trouble over the last 5 years. And that's partly because the Australian regulation of the financial services sector is by and large done pretty well. And as I said, I'd be happy to talk for 2.5 hours about all of the issues in how it was badly done in the United States, not the least starting with Ronald Reagan. And that's why it's important to get it right. The alternative to having a price is that you simply regulate and we simply ban emissions tomorrow. Something tells me that might not be wildly popular given what that would do to our society, given where we are at the moment. It's about trying to organise a transition in a sensible way, and that's why prices are effective in doing that. The and those countries that try and do stuff through pure regulation, places like the Soviet Union, actually wind up by and large being very highly polluting societies. So it's not the way I would be recommending that we go. In terms of the mechanics of how a tax works, the Australian government is talking about a producer tax. So that means that the person who produces the carbon, so by and large that's power stations and very large heavy industry, will pay the tax. So the design we're talking about is one in which, roughly speaking, 800 odd people, or firms, by and large they're companies, 800 companies will pay a carbon tax, the rest of us will not. However, the whole point about a market-driven society is that when the prices for a whole bunch of producers go up at once, by and large they will tend to pass that price on, and that's particularly what will happen with electricity. So the increase in cost for electricity producers will ultimately get passed on to electricity retailers, who will pass that on and increase the prices of the bills that we all pay. So yeah, we'll see prices going up, but we won't get a little line item that says, you have effectively emitted this many tonnes of carbon and therefore you have paid this carbon tax. For obvious reasons, that would be a hideous quantity of administration, indeed a truly Soviet level of administration, not one I would be recommending. And that's why the Australian government is talking about a producer tax, and it's actually quite an efficient tax. One of the reasons we economists quite like it is that it's actually going to be relatively cheap to collect. Taxing coal exports is a really tough problem, but it fits into the same kind of idea. Around the world, people are by and large taxing carbon emissions at the point that they are produced. We are talking about taxing coal miners, because when you dig coal out of the ground, essentially some methane gets released, and that's a very potent greenhouse gas. So they will be paying tax. But the people who then burn the coal and turn it into electricity will be paying the tax at that point. So coal-fired electricity power stations will be paying tax there, but people who go and export it and then burn it overseas will hopefully be paying it in their own country. And it's worth remembering that an increasing number of countries around the world are in fact starting to impose carbon taxes, amongst other things, on coal-fired electricity stations.
Thank you, John. Look, I would like to thank Slow TV and Community Radio 3CR for recording this event and making it available to a wider audience. I'd like to thank Federation Square for providing the venue, and the Sustainable Living Festival for giving us the occasion to discuss these issues. I'd like to acknowledge the support of future leaders and, above all, recognise the City of Melbourne and its 10-year-old free program of Melbourne Conversations. A quick reminder, if you want to be on the list for email updates of future events, then you can email Melbourne Conversations, melbourne.conversations@melbourne.vic.gov.au, or you can leave your email address at the back of the room on your way out. Finally, and most importantly, please join me in thanking our panellists, Don Henry, Isabella Rataitak-Yusko, Kathy Oak and John Daly. Thank you very much.